Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Expert Insights webinars. I am your host, Don McLean, and today's session is focused on ensuring success in implementing EMA Policy 70 and Health Canada PRCI. This webinar today is presented by MMS and TrialAssure. As an award-winning data-focused CRO, MMS brings insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. And as the technology arm of MMS, TrialAssure is a leading transparency technology suite supporting clinical trial registration, disclosure, data sharing, anonymization, and plain language summary activities. Here to present today is Kelly Valiant and Swathi Panditi. Kelly Valiant is Director of Global Transparency Strategy and Compliance, and he is responsible for providing transparency strategy, consulting, providing technical expertise on regulatory requirements and health authority registries, assisting clients and colleagues in navigating regulations, and bringing an innovative design for transparency approach to ensure alignment across the organization. With more than 20 years of experience, Kelly was previously the head of clinical trial disclosure and transparency at Gilead Sciences and held leadership positions at Novartis, Amgen, and Pharmacia. Swathi is a senior regulatory operations specialist at MMS and leads transparency projects with nearly 10 years of experience. She has a regulatory affairs certification from RAPS in both the US and the EU. Prior to MMS, Swathi was focused on regulatory efforts at GE Healthcare and Brigham Health, Brigham and Women's Hospital. Additionally, she earned her master's degree in Reg Affairs from Northeastern University. Thanks again to our presenters for joining us today. And as a reminder, your microphones will be muted for the duration of this session. We'll be sending out a recording following this call. And if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A at any time via the icon at the top right of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many of them at the conclusion of today's session. With that, I'll turn it over to Kelly Valiant. Kelly.
Great. Thanks, Don. Thanks for that great introduction. And welcome to everyone who's joining this webinar. A special welcome back to those who joined our first webinar, gaining a foundational understanding of Policy 70 and Health Canada PRCI. This second webinar is the follow-on to that. And what we're going to be covering today is we'll be doing a brief review of what we did cover in webinar number 1. For those of you who weren't able to attend, however, that webinar is available on our MMS YouTube channel if you have interest to look at that. We'll be reviewing some lessons learned from EMA Policy 70, as well as from Health Canada PRCI, looking at key takeaways for both Policy 70 and PRCI, looking at some strategies in terms of approaching these activities within the transparency space, including insourcing and outsourcing, looking at where efficiencies can be gained, and discussing some challenges that you may be faced with. And we're focused here today on a case study of looking at a particularly challenging aspect of this, which is collaborative development programs. And then we'll be looking to the future. We don't have a crystal ball, but we see a pattern developing of where we may be headed and what the near to midterm future in the disclosure and transparency space may hold for us. So first, a review of webinar number 1, gaining a foundational understanding of Policy 70 as well as Health Canada PRCI. This webinar was held on June 25th. As a quick review, I think we all recognize, if you're familiar with these activities, that we're in a state of flux. And disclosure and transparency is a rapidly evolving landscape. We're moving beyond being a simple checkbox compliance activity, and we really are moving toward and transitioning to becoming a critical, central coordinated and strategic part of a broader clinical transparency approach. In that webinar, we reviewed the recent addition of one of a growing list of transparency activities, that being Health Canada PRCI specifically. We reviewed the key elements of Policy 70 and compared and contrasted that with PRCI. The key messages that we hope that you took away from that webinar are transparency is increasing and it will continue to increase. And we highly recommend that sponsors, not only sponsors, but vendors as well, look across their organizations to ensure that any information and documents and data that may become publicly available are harmonized and are carefully considered at the initiation of generation of those materials. Very quickly, some of the differences between Health Canada PRCI and Policy 70. Policy 70 came into effect in January 2015, with the first packages being posted to the EMA clinical data website in late 2016. Since then, there's been many packages that have been posted, and with the announcement of Brexit, Policy 70 has been put on hold until further notice. Health Canada's PRCI came into effect in 2019, and as you can see here, continues to expand and includes not only prospective submissions, but also retrospective submissions. One of the key things that I wanted to point out here, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but is the response time in responding to questions regarding the packages upon review by the regulatory authority. In Canada's PRCI case, the sponsor only has 5 days to respond to any comments generated by Health Canada. On the other hand, for the EMA, the sponsor has 20 days. What we have found, our experience is that the 5-day turnaround time for any comments really is very, very tight, particularly with larger packages or with complex comments that come back. And so you really have to scramble and plan ahead for that. But let's not forget who the audience is for this. It really is the patient. And in addition to the patient, it's independent researchers. So the information that is being released through Health Canada and through the EMA in the form of these clinical documents, the question arises, will patients and caregivers in particular, researchers will be more familiar, will they be able to find, navigate, organize, and really understand and make sense of the information that's being released? The CSR is a very complex document. The Module 2 document is a very complex document. Will the layperson, the average patient, be able to make sense of it? We need to keep that in mind, because that's the ultimate goal, is to increase transparency and provide information to everyone. So let's set the stage. We're going to be talking about today some of the strategies in successfully implementing Health Canada's PRCI as well as EMA Policy 70. And we're going to be talking on behalf of both the vendor, which we are, MMS and TrialAssure, as well as the sponsor. And the question that you may have in your head and may be raised is, what qualifies you to speak on behalf of both the vendor and the sponsor? You are, after all, a vendor. So to that end, I'm going to ask Swathi to speak on our experience and how we can speak on behalf of the sponsor in regard to this.
Great. Thank you, Kelly, for the brief summary of our previous webinar and for setting the stage for our current one. Hello, everyone. My name is Swati Penditi, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to begin with our experience as a vendor in the transparency space for both EMA Policy 70 and Health Canada's public release of clinical information, so-called PRCI requirements, over the last few years. We'll speak to our specific experiences and challenges in our later slides, and our intention is to not overwhelm you with our experience, but provide you with challenges that we faced, tips to overcome these challenges, and we also hope to provide you with pointers on planning and working efficiently with these packages that can be really burdensome on multiple cross-functional teams. MMS has a vast experience in assisting multiple sponsors with preparing and submitting these packages. We were also fortunate to have assisted with the very initial packages posted on the EMA's clinical data website and to Health Canada's PRCI portal. We assisted with preparation and submission of multiple packages in different therapeutic areas for Policy 70 and currently have a large number on hold ever since the policy was put to halt in 2018. We have also successfully submitted 4 large packages as part of PRCI requirement over the last year or so, and are also currently working on 4 others actively. I would like to now turn it over to you, Kelly, to speak on some of your past experience on these submissions.
Great. Thanks, Swati, for that overview. And again, the question arises, how can you speak on behalf of sponsors, right? We are a vendor, a CRO. To provide some context, I was previously, as Dawn mentioned, global head of clinical trial disclosure and data transparency at a large sponsor organization. And I happened to be there when Policy 70 was introduced. And we explored both insourcing and outsourcing of Policy 70 activities. Ultimately, we decided initially to insource Policy 70, the reason being that this was new to the entire industry. And no one knew what they were doing. They were building process. The EMA was building their process as well as they went along. We had the intent, however, to outsource or look for an outsourced partner once we had submitted a couple packages and had control over the process and really understood what the EMA specifications were and the requirements were. And as we all know, if you're familiar with Policy 70, the guidance changed multiple times in the intervening time. So after that first year, late 2016, early 2017, the group that I led was responsible for submitting and subsequently posting about 400,000 pages. In comparison to what the EMA posted totally for that year, which was 1.3 million pages, that accounted for about 30% of all the pages that were posted publicly, a pretty significant amount. In addition to that, though, MMS, as Swati indicated, has extensive experience working with sponsors on both Policy 70 and Health Canada PRCI, and in several cases, either Policy 70 or PRCI was new to the sponsor, so MMS has had the opportunity to work with them and assist them in addressing questions and even helping develop their internal processes. So let's talk about lessons learned from Policy 70 and Health Canada PRCI, a brief overview. Policy 70 first and foremost, planning. I can't overemphasize this. I encourage you to have an organization-wide disclosure transparency policy in place. This is critical to success. Not only does it provide awareness for the entire organization, but it provides a focus for the organization on the importance of these activities. Develop a process. Even though the regulations are changing, even though the requirements are changing, having a base process in place is really very important. It ensures cross-functional understanding, it allows for repeatability, and it allows for scalability. Yes, you may have to tweak the process as you move forward and as guidelines change, but at least you have something in place to build upon. Plan ahead. Redact and/or anonymize once for multi-use. This is becoming ever more important. For example, redact or anonymize protocols and SAPs for clinicaltrials.gov, a new regulation with the final rule that came into effect in 2017. These documents can and should be reused for submission for Policy 70 as well as for PRCI. And perhaps most important of all, take action. Don't wait. You don't have a whole lot of time. It's 180 days from the date of submitting a product MAA to the EMA or type 2 variation. Define the team, ensure all stakeholders are included, not only the core team, but the extended team, reviewers, as well as any vendors that are involved in the process. Train early and repeat often. Many team members may not have participated in the preparation and submission of Policy 70 packages. This will become a recurring theme throughout our discussion. Keep the larger picture in mind. Who is the target audience? Already mentioned this. And take precautions to guard against malicious intent and actions to re-identify patients. This does happen, and we have to do everything in our power to protect our patient confidentiality and patient privacy. This will become ever more difficult as algorithms and as breaking codes become more sophisticated, but in turn, anonymization codes and algorithms will become even more sophisticated in turn. Coordination is critical. Ensure all parties with a vested interest have a seat at the table. Keep in mind, disclosure and transparency activities extend beyond the traditional boundaries of just clinical development. For example, it includes corporate legal, data privacy officer, marketing or your post-authorization organization, CMC manufacturing, preclinical, and there are others. We can go on. So this cuts across the entire organization. Establish the authoritative table of contents for Policy 70 and for Health Canada PRCI and start collecting the documents. You may assume that because a table of contents is in place for the original submission, that it can be reused for Policy 70 or PRCI. That's not always the case. This, for me, over and over again, has been a pain point. And getting agreement on the table of contents takes time and can be extremely difficult. In addition, you also have to plan for new documents that may be included based on RTQs in the review process if you are starting early, which I recommend. So there could be some surprises along the way. And a note regarding CCI. If you're familiar with these processes, there's going to be minimal CCI. There's ample evidence now that shows that there really is very little in the way of defensible CCI in Policy 70 packages. That requires that sponsors and their partner vendors ensure that all stakeholders know and understand what CCI and potential CCI is for the program. Make sure to do your due diligence. Search all sources of public information and public release, not only publications, manuscripts, and posters. Review your EPAR. Some CCI may have already been released. Check all relevant regulatory authorities where you plan to market your product or where you've run clinical trials. I've run into situations where a CRO working on behalf of the sponsor has inadvertently released documents to a local authority, and the local authority has posted those on the website without redacting or anonymizing any information. It's inadvertent, but it happens. Engage your SMEs early. Meet with SMEs individually and review expectations for CCI. Leverage past experience and feedback from the EMA, not only Policy 70 or Health Canada PRCI, but also FOI requests, Policy 43 experience. If and when possible, show examples of what has versus what hasn't been accepted. And remember, even if an SME reviewer has participated in past review, it may have been a year ago. This is not their primary responsibility. They may not remember all the nuances and steps in the process that they need to take. Remind them. Again, manage expectations, train early and often, and repeat. Finally, consider establishing a central redactions or anonymization coordinator, a project manager, if you will, for these processes. Critically important for coordination and facilitation of the entire process end to end. You can see here some of the activities and responsibilities that they may be involved in. But we highly recommend assigning a coordinator, whether it be internally within the sponsor organization or with your partner vendor. I'm going to turn it back to Swati now for some lessons learned in Health Canada PRCI.
Thank you, Kelly, for your great insights on the Policy 70 packages. And I know we all agree that, you've seen similar instances in both packages because they're so similar. And I will be speaking about the challenges and strategies that we implemented in each phases of these redaction cycles, especially focusing on Health Canada's PRCI submissions. So to begin with planning, as Kelly mentioned, planning is key with any disclosure submissions. We encourage sponsors to start determining the scope and the table of contents of the dossier even before the submission for marketing application is made. So this can be done at least 1 year to 6 months in advance, depending on the size of the package for proactive submissions, and as soon as the Health Canada request is sent in for retrospective or on-request submissions. As you all know, identifying and validating the scope can be really challenging, especially with teams newer to this requirements, or in cases of paper submissions, or when non-CTD structured documents like CSRs or appendices are involved. So we recommend noting out the out-of-scope pages and start drafting the out-of-scope leaflets for these documents even before the process initiation meeting. And speaking a little bit more about the process initiation meeting or the PIM meeting, Health Canada allows sponsors to request for a PIM meeting 120 days prior to the final regulatory decision and up to 20 days following the regulatory decision. And we highly encourage sponsors with and without experience in these submissions to request and consult with Health Canada prior to finalizing your package. You will need to send in the agenda in advance to the meeting and along with a list of questions. You may ask questions related to scope, confirm TOC scope, format on out-of-scope leaflets, timelines, etc. And it's also beneficial to confirm the approach for redactions or anonymizations that you wish to take and discuss about any sensitive data that you strongly feel is out of scope or has a higher risk. Lastly, it's also recommended to confirm the format of the submission, that is ECTD submission or CESG submission versus box uploads. And I'll be speaking a little bit more in detail about the advantages of using box versus ECTD submissions in our later slides. Next is establishing redaction and submission timelines that can be really burdensome, especially with large packages and short timelines, right? So you want to make sure every step has a corresponding phased timeline that adheres to the overall Health Canada timeline. This will not only help teams to ensure process continuity, but also handoffs that are maintained at each stages. Lastly, in case of paper submissions, additional planning time is required to allow for document processing of the scanned documents to be OCR'd. So this will help minimize the manual effort and will help process documents easily when you're using an automated tool in the later stages. Next slide, please. Okay, before initiating redaction or anonymization, right, ensure your strategy is developed across the organization, like Kelly mentioned, and that it is in alignment with the agency's guidances and expectations. Also check for previously redacted and disclosed documents. Review what's already disclosed, and if the redacted information is still considered confidential and holds true at the time of PRCI disclosure. For example, if any publicly available information from ct.gov or other agency disclosures, publications, abstracts, press releases, etc., that may have confidential information that has been masked prior to the drug approval, but may not be confidential anymore after approval. And if multiple parties are involved, such as a vendor or a CRO performing redactions, or if you have a study partner, make sure everyone is aligned on the redaction approach so there is no duplication of efforts after. And there are also a lot of multiple automated tools available that can effectively redact and anonymize, but they may have some deficiencies in entirely capturing personal information or may have false hits, right? For example, subject IDs embedded in an image that may not be redacted or masked by a tool. So we encourage teams to perform a manual and a scientific QC of the redaction proposal documents, or at least perform review on the selected pages with high identifiers to ensure that there are no instances missed by the software. Moving on to performing thorough CBI searches. And as Kelly mentioned, and based on our experience, we've seen very minimum CCI being accepted by agencies over the last few years and also by Health Canada, right? Before proposing anything as CBI, we strongly recommend performing that thorough CBI search on public domain and also collect potential CBI items from the sponsor's subject matter experts, their regulatory teams or legal teams. We at MMS use a CBI or CCI matrix to collect the public information and also the potential CBI information along with its justifications, and we use this as a source for redacting and performing quality control checks on the documents. We also face challenges with sponsors teams not understanding CBI or the regulations. So educating teams on the requirements and expectations on justifying CBI is crucial for drafting a robust justification that likely will be accepted by the agencies. Okay, moving on to the proposal package stage. So beginning late last year or early this year, Health Canada has been providing an option for sponsors to submit the proposal package via a shared site called Box. And sponsors with retrospective submission requests that have short timelines or are in paper format have found this option very useful. Uploading to Box also alleviates the burden on the sponsors by not submitting an ECTD or worrying about document publishing, ECTD compilation, etc. But it also helps Health Canada reviewers to easily access the documents. And while there are advantages in using Box, we have seen sponsors who prefer to use ECTD as a formal submission process per their SOPs and for better ECTD tracking purposes. And moving on to CBI redaction control sheet. So any proposed redaction, CBI redactions should be accompanied with its justifications provided in a redaction control sheet. While we had many initial questions on the redaction control sheet, Health Canada later released an instructions tab within the template. So these instructions are really helpful to understand how Health Canada wants sponsors to fill the proposed CBI text, add in the initial justifications, and also use it for updated justifications. So be sure to read through the tab prior to completing the sheet. And next is ensuring your anonymization report reflects the redaction or anonymization in the dossier is also important. So keeping track of different variables and deviations from your proposed rule set can be really difficult when dealing with large packages. So we recommend using a tracker or a draft anonymization report to keep tab of variables and its transformations as you work on the study documents. You could also use this later for QC purposes. Lastly, when using box or even CESG submissions, as Kelly mentioned, ensure there is a solid process in place for document handoff between various teams like redaction teams or review teams, even before prior to approval and submission. Great, thank you. All right, now we have comment incorporation stage and the final redacted package submission stage. So sponsors often receive comments from Health Canada on their proposal to PI or even CBI. And at times we've seen Health Canada commenting on a particular study or a document, but may have overlooked similar proposals in another study. And this may be due to various reasons, right? Like different reviewers reviewing at different times, different review cycles, etc. So in such cases, it is the sponsor's responsibility to have a dialogue with Health Canada on maintaining consistency, or even to push back on the comments if there is a risk of re-identification. And this happens, right? Sometimes in cases where same patients are enrolled in multiple studies, there is a higher risk of re-identification across multiple documents. And similarly, if any comments are received on the anonymization report, it will have to be evaluated across the entire package and documents. Health Canada has been very flexible and cooperative in responding via emails. So utilize this opportunity to ask questions along the way in case of any uncertainty. And for the final disclosure package, since the timeline window is very short, like you've seen, sponsors only have 5 days to incorporate all changes to the comments and finalize it and submit to ESG. So we recommend to keep the finalization stages, the publishing or submission ready checks, or even ECTD building to keep moving it on a continuing basis. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the key takeaways, right? I'd like to summarize the key takeaways that you've heard and seen with our experiences in both of these Policy 70 and PRCI packages. Starting with ensuring scope, like we've said it so many times, ensuring scope early on across all parties is very, very important. And ensuring timelines that are well coordinated amongst all stakeholders is also key. You will need an experienced team who are proficient in using automated tools and also performing thorough scientific QC and who are flexible to incorporate those changes quickly. Alignment on PPD and CCI across various regional teams also comes into play when you have multiple stakeholders. Do not underestimate the effort, and I cannot stress this enough. And I'd like to close this slide by stating one of Benjamin Franklin's quote, who says, "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." And it holds so true, especially in case of planning for prospective submissions in both cases, not just PRCI. And I think in any case when there's a regulation and you need to comply to it, planning is always a key. In our next slide, Kelly and I will be tag teaming to provide our perspective on outsourcing versus insourcing for these transparency projects. While there are advantages and disadvantages to both processes, our intention is to not highlight one or the other, but provide our viewpoint based on our experience. And we'll speak to our experience within each of these topics and alternate between Kelly and I. I'll start with outsourcing, right? And with outsourcing, we've seen sponsors mention timelines can be less burdensome when outsourced due to flexibility in adapting to the timelines quickly. Also, vendor teams are more focused on a single timeline, while sponsor teams usually have multiple competing timelines and priorities. Vendor teams have a dedicated transparency professionals who are experienced with deeper understanding of transparency regulations and guidances. They also have the benefit of working with different sponsors, different studies, various therapeutic areas, and hence would have more experience in handling these packages. They also tend to keep a tab more closely and have more insight on any transparency trends. Next would be with dedicated project managers and transparency leads, a vendor would have more flexibility to facilitate redactions and submissions, and to also reinstate projects quickly if they had to be on hold for a short or long period of time, like in cases of Policy 70. And lastly, to keep up with the emerging industry trends, vendors or CROs are more focused on innovative technologies and also seem to have a potential to scale up quickly. Kelly, I'm going to hand it over to you to speak about your experience on insourcing.
Yeah, so I'll speak about insourcing briefly here. Some of the challenges in insourcing are prioritization of competing programs, right? Policy 70 or Health Canada PRCI, transparency in general is not a #1 priority for the organization, largely still viewed as a compliance function. And therefore, getting everyone to focus on these activities can be somewhat of a challenge. There are tight timelines. If you're in a large organization with multiple submissions that are concurrent, there may be competing priorities, and the timelines can really be a challenge. Training in-house staff really is critical, and I think we keep repeating this over and over and over again, but train early and train often, and prioritize these activities. If at all possible, seek executive management support for these activities. Otherwise, it's not going to receive the attention that it deserves. Certainly, there are advantages within the sponsor, direct interaction with the agencies. Keeping up with current trends can be a challenge. Generally, if there is a disclosure and transparency group, they have multiple responsibilities across registering clinical trials, posting results, preparing packages for Policy 70, Health Canada PRCI, preparing for plain language summaries, so on and so forth. It can be difficult to keep up with the trends, keep up with regulations. CCI awareness and education is always critical. And of course, the sponsor obviously has greater insight and more in-depth knowledge into what may or may not be CCI. However, your vendor partner may have greater insight into what potentially would be accepted as CCI or not accepted as CCI. There is the potential within a sponsor to have a narrow scope of experience. I mean, you're working on a limited set of products, maybe a limited set of indications or disease areas. And so you may be focused solely on that. If you're an orphan indication organization, your experience may be solely in orphan indications. If you expand to general products, investigational products, it may be a very different experience for you. And the lack of exposure across the organization can be a challenge. And getting the attention of the different functions and the leads of the different functions can be a challenge. And impressing upon them really the priority and the focus of these activities. And once set on a path, if you decided on a technology, if you decided on a vendor, it may be difficult, or if you brought a technology in-house, it may be difficult to extricate yourself from that technology or change directions, because 3 years from now, our environment is going to completely change. And if you've committed to a technology today and you brought it in-house and you've developed it in-house, are you going to be able to adapt and course correct when there are different and new regulations that come into play? Let's talk about some efficiencies very quickly. So cross-utilization, back to planning. It all starts from the beginning when you're the inception of the document. So plan and prepare your documents from inception. How are these documents going to be used? What are the audience? Who are the audience for these documents? Are they simply used for Health Canada, or are they simply used for Policy 70 or other uses? Will documents be released for other regulatory authorities, PDMA? What about protocols and SAPs for CT Gov and NIH, FOI requests, Policy 43? Seek to look for cross-utilization of documents, reuse of documents across different regions, across different processes and situations. Developing experience across multiple sponsors and several use cases for documents has allowed MMS to develop and establish a comprehensive set of anonymization and redaction rules that we've built into our TrialAssure suite of software, and that can be leveraged by our sponsors. Involve stakeholders and partners across all regions and functions, and align an approach. Tools and processes to support common redaction and anonymization of dossiers and documents supporting multiple agency requirements is really, really key. So start with the end in mind. When anonymizing retrospective documents, unfortunately, in my experience at least, some amount of redaction is going to be required. Utilizing a tool that supports both redaction and anonymization is definitely advantageous, especially moving forward, instead of doing these as two separate processes. One of the advantages that MMS and TrialAssure has is in our TrialAssure suite of applications, we've paired anonymization with redaction, both of data sets as well as documents. And so we can leverage the same rules or some of the rules applied to data sets and apply them to documents. So there is consistency. This is an iterative process. So using a comprehensive tool is definitely advantageous. And ensuring that you have certainly quantitative risk assessment built in, but also allow for qualitative risk assessment if redaction is used. The tool should facilitate the process and not vice versa. The process is first. Tools are only meant to facilitate. I've seen so often that a tool is released to an organization and the organization says, here's your new tool, have at it. And then nobody uses it, or nobody uses it to its full efficiency because the support and infrastructure aren't behind it. That is critical. There's a question of redaction versus anonymization, which we'll come to in a couple minutes. Is the tool, is the process scalable? Is it flexible? Can both be achieved? We think it can. I think that we've proven that in our experience. And of course, focusing on risk assessment. This is what authorities are really looking toward, is what is the risk of re-identification? Swati?
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, I would like to present you with another efficiency, that is lean authoring. So thinking proactively even before we get to the transparency stage, what can we do to minimize the risk of personal and confidential information present in the study documents? We need to change the way we write. Authors tend to include as much as information possible that they think might be useful to the regulators, but they need to be more aware of the implications that happen at later stages where this information is mandated to be made publicly available. So the goal of lean authoring is to ensure writing documents that enables public disclosure without requiring extensive redactions or anonymization. However, while safeguarding the scientific information for regulators to evaluate the product. And another objective of lean authoring should be to present data that is usable for secondary research. Every clinical document, especially the ones in scope for disclosure, should be authored with data disclosure privacy in mind. This will later help during the redaction or anonymization stages and reduce the need to transform the direct and or indirect identifiers or to worry about the risk of re-identification. So lean-centered template authoring will foster shortened timelines, smoother reviews by the transparency regulators and end users. At MMS, we have a lot of best practices that we've included into our medical writing practices, but I'd like to present here with some examples. To begin with, do not repeat data in the body text that is already available in the in-text table. Cross-linking to sections instead of repeating it in text. And omitting company confidential information and personal information whenever possible. So for example, do not include subject IDs, say subject A, and instead of describing he or she, say the subject. And lastly, another takeaway is to keep the transparency ready instructions included in your CSR, protocol, SAP, or other appendices templates ready. Next slide, please. Okay, back to you, Kelly.
So I'm conscious of time here, and I think we were a bit optimistic in what we would be able to cover. So I'm going to just review one of the case studies at a very, very high level. I'm going to go through this very quickly. I want to leave some time at the end for questions and to talk about where we feel the future of the space is going. But if there is an interest to go in depth into this particular case study or any others that MMS has experience in, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to either organize another webinar or address questions that you may have. But one of the challenges is co-development programs can be very, very complex. I'm not going to go through this, as I said, in detail, but it's not a partnership. Number one, sorry to start, the partnership and collaboration doesn't end with the dossier submission, right? It's a partnership, not a collaboration. You know, I think this is really, really critical. Share processes, share approach, share best practices. There really is nothing proprietary here. We're all trying to do the same thing and meet the same goal. The priorities of the sponsors, the respective sponsors, are certainly going to be different. There's going to be a lead sponsor that submits their dossier either for Policy 70 or for Health Canada first. They have a priority to do this, but their co-development partner may have different priorities. They may not even be thinking about this because they may be thinking 8 months down the line when they're planning to do it. Come together, have discussions, agree on prioritization. Agree on who does what, when. Who should take the lead? Agree on the table of contents. I've been in situations where one sponsor in the partnership has been working from one table of contents and the other has been working from another table of contents, each from their respective submissions. Ultimately, this doesn't work and results in a lot of rework. There are legal considerations and liability considerations. Can you allow another sponsor to redact your documents if you're one of the partners? Or does each partner redact their own documents? And we can go into great detail around these discussions. Keep in mind that all work completed for the first package submitted either has to be redone or reused for the second package that's submitted. So look to harmonize the packages as much as possible. The experience of both sponsors may be different. One sponsor may have experience in doing 3 or 4 packages. Another may be brand new to this. So education. Anonymization and redaction approaches may be different. Seek to harmonize as much as possible. Guidance and regulations requirements are still a moving target. Be flexible. Determine how to quality check potentially thousands upon thousands of pages. Is 100% QC needed, or can you implement a risk-based approach? Most importantly, follow the guidance provided by the regulatory authority. If you have questions, Ask them. This is still new to everyone. We're still learning. Be prepared for inclusion of new documents. And where are the authoritative documents? Who has the master table of contents? What are the naming conventions and other technicalities? I've talked about table of contents over and over and over again. Start early, plan ahead. And acknowledge that there may not be 100% alignment amongst partners. One partner may choose to anonymize or redact in a certain way. There may be subtle differences in the other partner. That's okay. Seek to minimize this, but also have a plan to explain the differences. Align as much as possible. And again, importantly, keep in mind that this is a two-step process. The lead sponsor who submits their dossier for Policy 70 or Health Canada first certainly will be followed by the partner sponsor. If both packages can be aligned, that makes less work for everyone across the board. So what does the future hold? I wanted to take a quick look at where we see trends in the industry and where transparency in general is moving, and what we think is going to happen over the next 12, 18, 24, 36 months. Certainly, there's a greater push to anonymize. This is clear. Health Canada is pushing this heavily. Penalties for non-compliance. We know GDPR is already assessing penalties, not particularly within our industry, but the FDA just released guidance on monetary penalties for non-compliance with disclosure. How is EMA going to deal with the backlog? It's been a year and a half, almost 2 years, since Policy 70 was put on hold. How is that going to be handled? Reuse of anonymization and redaction rules across packages, across documents. This is why it's so important to select and implement a tool that can both redact and anonymize not only documents, but also data sets. Reuse of anonymization and redaction rules can really enhance efficiency. How do you future-proof your process? How do you future-proof your organization? How do you future-proof your technologies? It's a question that we're all asking. How do you harmonize across countries and regulatory authorities? Will there be harmonization? We know that Health Canada accepts Policy 70 redacted documents that were submitted for Policy 70. Do we know the opposite to be true? We don't as yet, as far as I know. And of course, have the idea of transparency by design. As Swati indicated, lean authoring, structured content management. The less PPD, the less CCI you can build into your document authoring process, the more efficient you're going to be in preparing your packages and preparing any documents that are released to the public. To provide a different view, looking at a greater focus of anonymization, certainly. With the recent federal court ruling, CIF et al. Versus HHS, February 24th, 2020. No change in the regulation for the final rule, just a change in clarification in the interpretation, but it has a huge cascade impact. And in August, as I indicated, the FDA mentioned and released guidance on monetary penalties related to non-compliance, which I just mentioned. Interactions of different regulations, different requirements, Policy 70, Health Canada PRCI, GDPR, Policy 43, 563, so on and so forth. How are all these going to interact? Are they harmonized? Currently, they're not. Will they be? We don't know. Phase 2 of Policy 70. Do we know the status of it? Is it going to happen? Phase 2 is meant to include patient data listings, anonymized, and plain language summaries. When will that come into effect? Presumably with the release of CTIS. Plain language summaries and enhanced patient engagement. Remember, this is our ultimate audience. This is who we're working for, is the patients. This is why I get up every morning and do this work, to help these patients, people in need of these products under development. Moving towards transparency as a value-added service. Moving away from the concept that transparency and disclosure is only compliance. Transparency can help across the board, across development, across the clinical trial lifecycle in so many ways. And if you'd like to have a conversation about it, I'd be more than happy to have a discussion with you about it. The ultimate goal, obviously, is to have harmonized requirements worldwide, which is highly unlikely, as we know, and a centralized portal. But ultimately, we should be looking toward transparency by design. Again, as Swati mentioned, lean authoring, structured templates, minimizing as much PPD and CCI in your documents from the start as possible. This will reduce the burden and the effort in so many ways across not only the development lifecycle, but also the clinical trial lifecycle. And then comprehensive transparency, patient ownership of their medical record. And what we see is ultimately a convergence of clinical development and consumer healthcare. Pulling data directly from EHRs, streaming data from wearables, so on and so forth. How are we going to address that? How are we going to maintain patient privacy? All questions that need to be addressed and need to be resolved. So with that, I know we are almost at time. We've got a few minutes for a couple questions, but hopefully this provided some insights and you were able to gather a few nuggets of information around implementing Policy 70 and Health Canada PRCI. And if we went through this very quickly, but if you do have any questions or would like any greater detail, reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Swati, for your insights. Kelly, as mentioned, we would like to move on to the Q&A portion of this webinar. It will go over slightly, so if you'd like to stay on, wonderful. If not, we can send you the recording just following. First question, for one of our packages, Health Canada offered to make changes to one document after review and asked us to submit the remaining dossier that had no comments. Have you come across such a situation? If yes, how have you handled it in ECTD?
Don, I can take that. So that's a good question. And yes, we have seen this with a couple of our sponsor packages, but we've always requested Health Canada that we will incorporate the changes and submit the full and final package, even when they offer to help. Not because we don't trust Health Canada, but this was mostly to make sure that all final documents were formally submitted via ECTD and that we also take the responsibility to finalize and archive it.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question that came through for you, Swati. Have you submitted any previously redacted Policy 70 packages to Health Canada? Not
until now. But keeping EMA's Policy 70 in mind, we have proposed and submitted packages to Health Canada with the EMA redaction conventions. For example, we use PPD and CCI instead of PI and CBI with the overlay codes and colors specific to the EMA, and Health Canada accepted it. Like we could later submit the same package with no rework to the EMA as well. So that went through. So we can also use that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. We did have a question about functionality for the TrialAssure suite. How are regulation changes maintained in a timely manner within the suite?
So let me take that. Within our suite of software, we have a suite called TrialAssure, which is comprehensive for clinical trial disclosure as well as transparency. And we have a process that is both partially manual as well as in part automated, in which we continually scan for and incorporate regulations and requirements for health authorities regarding the different aspects of disclosure and transparency. For example, in our application TrialAssure registry, we now include, I believe it's requirements for 40 different registries. And where possible, where defined by the individual registry, we program validation checks against data fields to ensure maximum opportunity of success of having that record passed by the regulatory authority once submitted. So we continually update it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly. Two more questions here. You mentioned collaborative programs as a particular challenge. Are there any other examples of challenges you've experienced?
Sure, let me take that as well, and then Swati, you can chime in as well. I think I mentioned during the discussion that orphan indications is a particular challenge, especially considering the populations that are involved and the numbers of patients that are involved. So a little bit more conservative approach when looking at orphan indications are needed, and you may need to either anonymize or redact more information rather than less. If you have, for example, a phase 2 study that has, a dozen patients included and has some information that is specific to a patient that you normally wouldn't redact in a larger patient population, you really need to look at this and evaluate it carefully and use your judgment and talk with the different functions and clinical. The same goes for pediatric trials, right? You need to be very careful with this. The primary mandate is patient confidentiality, and we want to ensure that we maintain that at all costs. Swati, anything additional to add?
No, that was great, but just based on my experience, at least with what I've seen, the strategy was agreed upon.
Nope, I think we lost.
Yeah, Swati. Looks like we lost Swati. No worries. Kelly, I do have one last question for you, and then we can close it out. Be cognizant of everyone's time. How can organizations build or modify their current processes to ensure facilitation of Policy 70 and Health Canada PRCI package?
Well, I think that we've mentioned several times during the course of the discussion, start with the end in mind. Yes. If you're developing your protocol templates, your CSR templates, your SAP template, even your informed consent, your EDC specifications, your clinical trial registry specifications, your results specifications, create those templates with the knowledge that those documents may and probably will be released to the public at some point in the future. And so authoring those documents with the end in mind and minimizing the amount of PPD, CCI, CBI will be advantageous to the sponsor in downstream, in cascade effects in so many ways, effort, time, cost, so on and so forth.
Okay. All right, very interesting. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Swathi. For those listening, if you have any additional questions on what you heard today, please just follow up with your point of contact at MMS or TrialAssure directly, or email media@mmsholdings.com, and we'll direct you straight to a presenter. For additional free webinars, visit mmsholdings.com/webinars, or follow MMS and TrialAssure on LinkedIn for updates. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and have a wonderful day.